Today, we are going to unpack a really fascinating analysis from psychologist Jordan Peterson. He tries to build a psychological profile of one of the most, polarizing figures in modern history, Donald Trump. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? Whether you love him or hate him, Donald Trump is not easy to pin down. Some see him as this brilliant businessman, others a larger-than-life showman, and for millions, a complete political game-changer. So how do you even begin to make sense of a personality that complex? Well, for this explainer, we're going to look at a framework from Jordan Peterson. He makes the case that if you understand just a few key personality traits, a much more coherent picture of the man starts to emerge. So let's dive in. First things first, Peterson says you have to look at Trump's life before he ever got into politics. He argues that this history isn't just some background noise, it's really the foundation for understanding who he is. So you look at this timeline, and it's not just a resume, right? The world of high-stakes construction, that requires some seriously tough negotiation skills. Then you have The Apprentice, which shows a total mastery of grabbing public attention. And writing 19 books, even with help, points to a kind of relentless drive. For Peterson, none of this is random. It's all evidence of very specific personality traits at work. Okay, so let's get to the core of the psychological assessment. This is where Peterson brings in a really key concept from personality psychology to frame his entire analysis. And that key term is plasticity. You can think of it as a measure of someone's ability to adapt and totally reinvent themselves. It's a mix of two of the big 5 personality traits, extroversion and openness. People who are high in this trait are really dynamic, and that's a word Peterson uses a lot to describe Trump. So how does this actually break down for Trump? Well, Peterson's assessment is that he's not just high, but extremely high in extroversion, especially the assertive part of it, and also pretty high in openness, which is what drives creativity. And he argues that this specific combination isn't just interesting, it's actually one of the strongest predictors we have for who becomes a successful entrepreneur. And here is where we get to the big contradiction. If he's got this dynamic, creative personality, how does that square with the aggressive, sometimes kind of bullying persona that so many people see? This is probably Peterson's most nuanced and interesting point. He says Trump solves what he calls the agreeableness paradox. See, the trait of agreeableness has 2 parts, politeness and compassion. Usually, if you're high in one, you're high in the other. But it's possible, though really rare, for someone to be super low in one and high in the other. Peterson's whole theory hinges on this, that Trump is very low in politeness, but, and this is the surprise, high in compassion.
Okay, so high compassion, where's the proof? Where does Peterson actually see evidence for this? Well, he turns to Trump's specific behaviors, and he starts with something you might not expect, his sense of humor.
He points to moments just like this one, which happened during a presidential debate. It's spontaneous, it's a little rough around the edges, and, arguably pretty funny. It's a line he just couldn't resist saying. And it's that kind of unfiltered humor that Peterson thinks is really significant. The argument here is that this kind of humor, even though it can be harsh, is exactly what allows him to connect with working-class people. Think soldiers, police officers, in a way that most politicians just can't. It's a kind of banter they get. And it also shows he's willing to be the butt of a joke himself, which you can see if you watch his Comedy Central roast. And this all leads to a pretty striking conclusion in the analysis. The gruff exterior, the impoliteness, it isn't the whole picture. Peterson's theory is that it's actually a defense mechanism, a kind of mask he wears to protect an underlying compassionate nature from the brutality of public life. All right, the next piece of evidence is much more private, but Peterson argues it's just as telling. He suggests we should look at the state of Trump's own family. So the analysis points out that his children are actually pretty stable and remarkably scandal-free, especially when you consider the insane amount of media scrutiny they're under. His wife, Melania, is seen as elegant and very private. The argument is simple. In an environment where journalists are literally paid to find scandal, the fact that there isn't much is pretty significant. And this quote really just captures that whole line of thinking. Peterson suggests that the lack of scandal isn't for a lack of trying by people watching. For him, this suggests that Trump has, in his own words, properly ruled his own roost, which kind of pushes back against claims that he's temperamentally dangerous. But all of this personality analysis is really just leading up to Peterson's final and, in his view, most important piece of evidence, the ultimate test of his character. He brings up a key principle from clinical psychology, which is that if you really want to predict how someone's going to behave in a specific situation, the best data you have isn't their personality. It's how they behaved in that exact same situation before. Personality traits are useful, sure, but past action is a much better predictor. And in the case of predicting how Trump would act as president, well, we have the data. Peterson highlights this number as maybe the single most important outcome of his presidency: 0. For all the talk and all the concern about his temperament, the U.S. didn't enter any new wars during his entire 4-year term. And it goes beyond that. The analysis also points to other key things: negotiating the Abraham Accords, which a lot of experts thought was impossible, a general lack of any huge international catastrophes, a decent economic record at home, and this idea that his classic unpredictability was actually a strength when he was negotiating with authoritarian leaders. So, the final conclusion of this whole psychological profile is pretty much this. While you might have some serious concerns based on his personality traits alone, the actual record of his presidency, peace and a lack of total disaster, that serves as the ultimate rebuttal. In this view, the actions simply outweighed the temperament. And that kind of leaves us all with a final question to think about. For any leader, what's the right balance? How much weight should we really give to personality, to temperament, to style, compared to the concrete results and the actions they take when they're actually in power? It's definitely a question worth thinking about.